I was raised Catholic. Then I became an atheist from, I don't know, age of 15 or something like that. Sometimes around early 20s, I started like saying I was a pagan, but not really knowing what that meant. Just saying like I kind of had some beliefs, but I didn't really know what they were. After I finished my first degree in like communications and media, I started reading philosophy in my own time, and that made me interested in paganism, basically. It was actually Nietzsche who made me, because Nietzsche kept on referencing so many classical things, and then I started like, I got to know more. So I started going back and reading Plato and everything, trying to, fill out the gaps that my education was missing. And then I just got really into all sorts of types. I mainly was researching like ancient Greek, but also like Aztec religion and Egyptian and Native American stuff I thought was cool. And I used to read a lot of Alan Moore comics and thought, he's a pagan author. I then realized that all of these religions are actually ethno-specific. So you don't pick and choose a religion in paganism. You are supposed to choose the religion of your people. And I was like, well, why don't I know about English paganism? And how come in England we never really talk about it? Because in England, you learn a lot about Apollo or like ancient Greek and Roman stuff. I got taught about Greek mythology and Roman Greek mythology, but nothing about any of the native mythology. And even when most people talk about native, they assume that you're talking about Celtic, even though the English nation was founded by the Anglo-Saxons, the English. And by the time they arrived in the 5th century, Celtic paganism was pretty much gone, with a couple of exceptions. But in England, it was almost entirely gone already by the time they got there. And then you have hundreds of years of paganism after that, which is our paganism, English paganism. But most people don't even talk about it or know about it. It's not taught in schools very much. So I was like, well, that's the kind of paganism I need to learn about. So then I pursued this path of learning all about English paganism and the Germanic pagan world in general, and finding out. From there, I was like going back and finding like, well, it didn't pop out of nowhere. Like the Anglo-Saxons were part of, Germania, what it was Tacitus would call, and then they were themselves from an earlier Indo-European culture, and learning about the Proto-Indo-Europeans and stuff. And then I went back to university, did a master's in this stuff. My dissertation was in horse sacrifices, and I couldn't help but notice that the horse sacrifices of Anglo-Saxons very much like horse sacrifices of the ancient Indo-Europeans, very much like horse sacrifices described in ancient India among the Aryans. So it's obviously all one thing. And then since then, I got that degree in like 2012. Since 2015, there's been all this huge amounts of more scholarship proving the Indo-European theory correct and the step hypothesis of Proto-Indo-European dispersal is correct, which had been a popular theory in the 19th century, but had gone out of fashion in the 20th century and the early 21st century, to the extent I couldn't really talk about it very much in my dissertation because it was frowned upon in 2011 still.
Thanks to a certain Austrian painter.
Well, yeah. Thanks to him, he's sort of partly responsible, but it's just like this zeitgeist after the war that anything, and not just that, like all sorts of history has to be like reconsidered and rethought out, and we can't think of like culture history anymore. But the genomic revolution since 2015 has really changed that, and now we can go back to some proper ideas about history, and we can see. The Proto-Indo-Europeans were real people and were perhaps the most influential people in the history of the world in terms of what's, like right now we're speaking in the language that's just because of them. And they're a significant part of the genome of all European people and many Asian people as well. So they're really important. And now, we were on the brink of saying that they didn't even exist in the late 20th century. And now we're finally back on track to learning about them again.
I'm interested in what you're saying about the Indo-European. I've talked to a lot of scholars on this channel, and I can go from 1 week to talking to one scholar, and I'll say Indo-European people, and they'll go, we don't use that term. And I'll say, but the next week, another scholar, and not even a conservative scholar, a liberal scholar, will just be throwing the word around because they're more into the linguist side. Mm-hmm. The people who study the languages have no issue using Proto-Indo-European, Indo-European. Yeah. But for some reason, it's like, in a certain group of, I don't know if it's archaeology, I have no idea, but like once in a while I'll run into somebody and they'll say, I don't like using that word Indo-European, it has a lot of baggage to it.
Yeah, I prefer Aryan. Let's call it that.
Do you prefer Aryan? But it's undeniable. Look at the way people speak in India. Oh, actually, you can go beyond India. There's people speaking all the way in the islands in Asia that have cognate words with people speaking in England. How else do you explain that other than they started in the Black Sea region and went in different directions? I just don't think there's any other explanation than that. I mean, like, I agree with you. Like, that should just be a done, like, that's solved now. But is that what it is? Is it between genetics and language? Is that where the divide is?
Basically, initially in the 18th century, Indo-European studies begins late 18th century, around the time, the same. It's about as old as America is. And everyone, it's just language. They're noticing language. But even early on, they're also noticing mythology correspondences. And then over the 19th century, this sort of school, this interdisciplinary school grows, and then you get people comparing skulls and things like that, and it becomes a racial aspect as well. And by the late 19th century, it was accepted that these were a people, and a lot of people believed that they came from the Pontic-Caspian steppe. But initially, it was just language. But in the mid-20th century, with the whole change in all the humanities, like in academia, Western academia, completely shift, and it really becomes unacceptable to talk about the Indo-Europeans, Proto-Europeans as a distinct people, because they didn't think the evidence, the archaeological evidence that had been used previously was actually sufficient to justify talking about them as such. And the ideas that the Yamnaya or the corded ware cultures were the Proto-Indo-European people, as have been previously speculated, they just thought that's just way too... You can't look at a skeleton and say what language it spoke. This is completely pseudoscience. Right. We're starting again. So, like, onwards in the 20th century, it just wasn't acceptable for historians and archaeologists to talk about the Proto-Indo-Europeans as a people. But with linguists, that didn't happen the same way, because linguists... The Indo-European language is absolutely a dead cert. It's one of the most reliably reconstructed ancient languages. And it's the oldest that you can be reliable. It's the oldest language that can be reliably reconstructed that far. There are, of course, much older languages before then, but we can't reconstruct them based on the extant languages of the day today. But they might shrink from talking about them in racial terms, but they've always been able. The word Indo-European wasn't like a forbidden term in linguistics, but it was in archaeology and history. So, but now in the last since 2015, that's changed a lot, and like I think especially like comparative. I've seen archaeologists now and comparative mythologists are just like mainstream universities are publishing papers about the genetics of Indo-Europeans. Harvard is publishing genetics of Europeans. Uppsala University is publishing stuff about comparative mythology, using archaeology as evidence of mythological cognates of different Indo-Europeans, assuming that this was a common people because we now have that genetic evidence. So now the genetic evidence is in place, now the other schools like comparative mythology, archaeology can all get on the train. But there are some people who are a bit slow for they're not gotten on board with it yet, and they're still living in the 90s and pretending that you can't talk about the Indo-Europeans as a people when they clearly are.